Good morning, friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us for another information sharing session. It's always nice to see us filling up this room and having some great conversations before the time. So we're really looking forward to your participation and hoping that we can enlighten you and help you walk away with some fantastic new ideas to go and implement out in all the various environments that you all work in. It's always nice to see a little bit of a mix between the public and the private sector, and everybody's getting along, and even a couple of competitors who seem to be talking to each other. So I'm enjoying that. Thank you very much. Our topic this morning is building a risk-aware culture for success, and it's obviously touching on so many different things that are incredibly important to us. You know, making people risk-aware is, of course, some of the biggest challenges we face in the marketplace that we work in, and all of us want to be able to create a culture of success. So the speaker that we're welcoming here this morning is Mira Butler. Mira has over 7 years of experience in risk management in the corporate environment. Her area of focus is in ERM, enterprise risk management, and working with companies to establish governance and enhance ERM processes through identification, analysis, and management of enterprise-wide and operational risks. Just to give you a brief introduction here, Mira's written a short paragraph here just to sort of set the tone for the presentation to come. And it really talks about the objective being to enhance your organization's ability to effectively manage uncertainty. Today's business world is constantly changing, it's unpredictable, volatile, and seems to become more complex every day. I'll add there, often every minute at the moment, the way things are changing. By its very nature, it's fraught with risk. Enterprise risk management is a comprehensive, systematic approach for helping the organization to identify, measure, prioritize, and respond to the risks, challenging its most critical objectives and related projects, initiatives, and day-to-day operating practices. But does your organizational culture reinforce your strategy and help you to take the right decisions on risks? All of this hard work that we put into this, ultimately, hopefully, helping people make better decisions by using the information that we provide them with. So this discussion session will explore ways in which to create a culture that reinforces and reflects the risk management standards, controls, policies, and frameworks. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mira. Mira, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm really excited to be here today and to share with you my knowledge and experience that I've gained over the years. Just to have a look around the room, whom of you here today are actually risk practitioners or risk professionals, just by a show of hands? Okay, great. So I think that this discussion that we're going to have is going to be very fruitful for you. I personally know what it feels like to be in an organization that looks at risk management or risk managers literally as a tick box exercise, rather than value adding. And it's more of a reactive approach rather than proactive. And, it all stems from how we as risk professionals approach the organization and how we instill risk within the organization. So if I just had to ask you the question, very simply, how would you define risk management? Anyone? No takers? Okay. I would put it very simply by saying risk management is about helping the business achieve its goals. So if we look at, strategy likes to talk about their 2 and 5 year horizons, okay? What do they want to achieve? What do they want to be? What is it that they want to do in the next 2 to 5 years? And risk management is there alongside with them, helping them achieve their goals by looking at what it is that could prevent them from achieving them. Okay, so that's what we're actually doing. But I think where we fall short is that in trying to articulate this very sort of eloquent description of risk management, we've boiled it down to policies and frameworks and processes, which is correct in itself. But if we stick to it very stringently, it then turns into being a proactive value-adding role into a compliance type role, which is literally a tick box. Okay, well, once a month, every quarter, let's sit around the room because the risk manager is going to nag us because she has to hand in, or he or she has to hand in a board report. So let's just fill in these risk registers. Okay, so even though our frameworks and policies are important, they're not sufficient. What is essential is the behavioral element. Okay, so what do I mean by that? It's the way in which people behave within an organization, and how do they react towards risk. Okay, what is their perception towards risk? And that is how we can drive culture change within an organization. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about various elements that we have for a good risk culture. Okay, first and foremost, tone at the top. Okay, I'm sure you've heard this time and time again. It is of utmost importance that we get buy-in, not only from the board, but from executive management as well. If you don't have your CEO backing you, okay, it's very difficult. You're going to enter into an organization feeling very frustrated, feeling as if you're just, a token person, because King, several years back, came up with, CROs, risk management. Oh, let's comply. Here we go. Here's your department. We'll see you when we see you. Okay, so you need genuine buy-in from the top. Secondly, we also need to have commitment to ethical practices. Okay, the organization needs to encourage whistleblowing. If you look further down the slide, I talk about appropriate risk behaviors. Okay, this should be rewarded. Inappropriate behavior should also be challenged or sanctioned. Okay, we shouldn't be engulfed in a culture of fear where mistakes or mishaps you get reprimanded for it, or if you bring about something that could be a potential risk to the organization, that you get ignored. Okay. Governance is very important. So we need clear accountability and ownership for risks. Okay, and this can only be done with continuous risk management. So risk management is not a quarterly activity that takes place. Okay, it takes place on a day-to-day basis. It needs to be instilled not only in the risk manager. I mean, the risk manager, we're there to facilitate, right? We're not the owners of the risk. But it needs to be instilled in each and every employee within the organization, from support staff right up to management. If we have a project that we're busy with, before we even start the project, okay, wait, stop. What are the potential risks here? Okay. I spoke about transparent risk information being communicated without fear and blame, the fear culture, okay. And we should mainly concentrate on what are the lessons learned, not, okay, you've done wrong, you're going to be punished. And always challenge the status quo. So what we did 20 years, even 10 years, maybe even 2 years ago, may have worked for that particular organization then. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be right now. And it also doesn't mean that the risks that we identified even a week ago could be the same risks that are here now. Case in point, digital. Okay, if you look at artificial intelligence, data processing, robotics, all of that is coming into play. That in itself can help risk management, but there's also other risks that are being posed, such as people risks. Okay, so we need to think about that on a daily basis. And then the last one deals with employee engagement and people strategy. So what I mean by this is taking cognizance of training and awareness, okay? Instilling this in everyone's day-to-day tasks and operations. So what is risk culture? Risk culture describes the values, beliefs, knowledge, and understanding about risk. Okay, so the Institute of Risk Management has this simple, what they call an ABC approach to risk culture in order to understand how culture works within the workplace. So A stands for attitude, B is your behavior, and C is the culture. All right, so your risk attitude is the position that an individual or a group of people would adopt in terms of how they perceive or their predisposition towards risk. Okay, risk behavior talks about risk-related actions, decision making, communication about risk, also the processes. Are we always cognizant of risk when we're doing these things? And risk culture, once again, your values, beliefs, and knowledge about risk. So, in essence, every organization has a risk culture. The question is whether the culture supports or undermines the long-term success of the organization. So why is risk culture important? Okay. All organizations need to take risks in order to achieve their objectives. However, in an inappropriate culture, it can either hamper the achievement of strategic, tactical, or operational risks or goals. It allows for activities that are at odds with your policies and your procedures. So based on what your policies, frameworks, procedures are, if they're too stringent and rigid, they can also stifle innovation. And you'll also get certain individuals that could be cowboys and disregard everything that you've put in place and still make that decision in any event, irrespective of the potential risk that it could create. All right? And all of this could lead to potential reputational and financial damage. So our aim is to balance risk and reward successfully. And how do we do that? What is the missing link? That is risk culture. So this diagram, I like to call it an onion ring. It's also from the Institute of Risk Management. It represents an integrated set of relationships between the individual, the organization, and ultimately your risk culture that's being created. So if we look at the individual level, you have your potential predisposition. What is their perception of risk? Okay, what are their personal ethical behaviors that they're adopting and bringing into the organization? These two onion rings are interrelated. And when people come into an organization, ultimately their values, beliefs, and attitudes contribute to the overall organizational culture. So you can see how people and the organization actually work together creating this culture. Okay? If we talk about a little bit more about organizational culture, it has two key elements. I like to call it, not I like to call it, it is called a double S model, okay? We're looking at the elements of sociability, and the second element is that of solidarity. So if your culture within an organization is high on the sociability aspect, people are doing things for each other because they want to. If it's very high on the solidarity aspect, okay, you focus on common tasks, shared goals, and mutual benefits. So the ultimate, in order to reach, or the Zen point, okay, of risk culture, is to strengthen both your sociability and solidarity ratings, okay, to have more effective risk management within an organization. So that's all great and very theoretical, but practically how do we do this? Okay. So firstly, we need to understand what is the current culture in our organization, and then establish what is the target state that we want to achieve. Okay? You need to treat this as a change management project. Okay? It needs to be taken seriously because culture change doesn't happen overnight. Okay? It's a process. You need resources to be allocated. You need buy-in, once again, from the top, being the board or council or whatever governing body you have, as well as executive management. Okay. Now, in order to identify the gaps and establish what exactly is your weaknesses and your strengths within your current organization, this risk culture model can be adopted. It looks at 4 self-assessment areas. Okay? It's tone at the top, governance, competency, and decision making. So let me talk you through that a little bit. If we're looking specifically at tone at the top, okay, we ask ourselves, risk leadership. Is the leadership of that organization consistently setting an example, okay? How, in terms of how they behave. Also, how do they deal with bad news? Are they creating a culture of fear, or are they encouraging openness? Okay. Can people talk openly without fear of any consequences or being ignored? If we look at the decision side of things, are they making informed decisions? Is risk management actually part of the strategy sessions? Okay? Or are you an afterthought? Is risk management part of project management? Or are you an integral part of the organization? Or are you only looked at afterwards? Because if you looked at afterwards, you're not really managing the risk, right? You're managing issues. Okay, in terms of reward, I worked for an organization where they took risk management so seriously that they actually put it into every single individual's KPIs. You know, obviously at different levels, depending on whether you were administrative or at a managerial level, senior manager, etc. But that was part of your KPI. And they rewarded you accordingly for taking decisions that are risk-based. If we look at governance, okay, how can we establish accountability, okay, and hold people accountable? In a way, this can come through your risk registers, in terms of highlighting who the risk owners are, who the control owners are, or the treatment owners are, setting a date, etc., for when are these going to be implemented. But we need to hold people accountable, but people need to understand it's not the risk manager that's the owner of the risk. Okay? It's the various business units, it's the various departments. Transparency. Do we talk openly about issues that affect us? And this happens from the top down and bottom up. Okay. And lastly, risk, the competency. If you look within your risk department, do you have the necessary skills, expertise? Are you guys being valued for what you do? Are you taken seriously within the organization? Are you effective? Are you resourced adequately? Okay, that's an important question. And lastly, in terms of skills, how do we, as risk professionals or practitioners, support the learning and development and raising of awareness of risk management? And we can talk about this maybe a little bit later, but I'll mention it now. You know, risk management, I always say, is, you know, for people who aren't in it and don't have a passion for it the way we do, they kind of find it boring. Okay, I mean, we're not coming there with fancy strategies, or we're not selling some awesome, sexy product. Okay, so standing up in an auditorium, giving a lecture is not necessarily always effective. We need to think out of the box. Okay, I've often found that I can stand and talk ad infinitum about risk management and what I know, and most people are on their smartphones, tweeting or liking Facebook messages. It's not effective. It doesn't get installed. So thinking out of the box means, how can we make this fun for the ordinary everyday person? One campaign that we did do lasted over a period of 2 quarters, but we created a cartoon character called Captain Risky. And every week, Captain Risky would give you short blurbs, very simplified wording, okay, not the fancy wording that we use, about risk management, explaining what is risk appetite, what is risk tolerance, why is this important, why do we need risk management in an organization. And at the end of the month, you would have questions which would be circulated throughout the organization, and the people that participated, you would pick 3 out of that group, and they would each get a little prize. And at the end of this whole campaign, we actually had a Who Wants to Be a Millionaire type of game show happening. And the buy-in and the participation that we got from that was phenomenal. And the way in which people actually looked at risk, and the fact that they understood risk and why we were there, made a huge difference to the efficiency of risk management as a whole. Gamification is another example, where you have, for example, in an engineering sort of field, building a bridge. Okay, so which departments are important? And if they don't pick risk as an example, oh well, there goes your London Bridge is falling down, right? Everything falls over. So those types of approaches, instead of just standing up and speaking to people, but rather getting them more engaged, more involved, that's also a way of helping in terms of risk culture and instilling risk. Right. I'm almost at the end, and I'm also almost out of breath. So what are the next steps? So we've discussed that we need to evaluate the as is, okay, and what is the target state that we want to achieve. Now, in between that spectrum is the gaps that you've identified within your organization, okay, and that's the changes that need to be made in order for you to reach that target state. So once you've established that, you put a plan in place, okay, have a roadmap with timelines, etc., and you start implementing it. And then we do the usual continuously monitor and review if changes need to be made. And slowly but surely, you will start seeing a change in your risk culture within your organization. And everyone, that's it from me. I now hand over to you guys for questions.
Thank you very much, Mira. That's fantastic, and it definitely gives us something to think about, especially in terms of how we go about implementing that risk culture. Are there any questions at all? Excellent, thanks.
Thank you very much, Mira. That was a wonderful presentation.
You.
I had 2 questions.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, which one do I pose? The easier or
the one
more
that
difficult?
I can answer.
Okay. All right, I didn't see any reference to the overall organizational culture, because my view is that it cannot exist in isolation.
No.
So what are the methods by which we make sure we only have one culture, not separate? So in other words, we couldn't have a risk culture, a finance culture. We sort of want one culture. How would you integrate all of this into one single culture?
We talk about risk culture, but risk is integral to the business. So it's part of each and every aspect of the business, okay? And when we enter into organizations, and I've entered into various organizations in my career. And you're right, each organization does have its own culture. And it starts with the individuals that enter into that organization. Whether you like it or not, individuals, groups of people, they ultimately affect an organization culture. So does leadership and the way in which they behave. So in order to change this, we need to change the behavioral element, okay? And we need to ask, and we need to have those discussions with the board, with the executive, and say, where do you see yourselves? Where do you want to go? What are the values and your beliefs that you want to implement within your organization? And we as risk management can help you achieve that. And this is how we can help you achieve that. And by them understanding that, that's how we start instilling the culture of risk, if that makes sense.
Hi, Mira. I just have a question with regards to, you mentioned the tone at the top.
Yeah.
And, you mentioned the initiative that you had with Captain Risky.
Yeah.
A lot of the time, the executive doesn't pay much attention to awareness campaigns. And so how do you influence, as a risk manager, that C-suite and board level?
Yeah, so I've been on both sides of the spectrum, okay? I've been in an organization which totally dismissed risk management, and I was literally there just as a token person to tick the box, okay? Very frustrating, to a point where, for me, I'm absolutely passionate about risk management. If I feel I'm not adding value, as hard as it is, I walk away, okay? And in terms of the campaign of Captain Risky, the CEO luckily was on board, and he was the acting CEO at the time for the interim period, but he chaired many risk and audit committees, so he understood the importance, and I think that's where I kind of lucked out. But the way in which I think sometimes we underestimate ourselves. As risk managers, we're relationship builders, okay? Without having that relationship, it doesn't matter if it's with the cleaner or the tea lady or if it's with executive, okay? We're building that rapport every single day. So we just need to continue building that rapport, building the trust, and having those one-on-one discussions. If you're lucky enough to participate in board at a board level, or if your manager or the CRO is, chat to them and say, this is the idea that we have. Let them be your voice, and explain why it is important. Because I think most organizations, it's not that they don't want to do it, they don't understand why they need to do it. And if they understand the why, the how becomes easy. And put it in your budget.
What do you do in an environment or in an organization where there isn't a specific dedicated risk professional, risk practitioner? Because some organizations believe, and it's actually touching on the culture aspect, that they don't really want to have a one-man department. So they almost want to see it as part and parcel of either internal audit, so take care of it to some extent, or they see it as the owners being the executive management, taking basically ownership of risk management in the organization.
Which is correct to a certain extent.
To a certain extent, but the element of facilitation
is missing.
And try and embedding that in the culture of the organization. Now, I think it's more probably common amongst private sector because they want to keep their head office costs as low as possible. And like you probably would have experienced, risk management is not seen to be, or even risk management on its own is not seen as something that they would want to specifically invest in terms of resources, etc., because they see it as part and parcel of the risk owner's responsibility. How would you then, where do you start to try and influence the culture to see it as an important aspect. I mean, we know about King 4, it's being dealt with. There's a risk committee and an audit committee. Where do you start to try and influence a culture, to see it as an important part of the organization and something that should be looked at is in a little bit more?
So I was going to say start with King, okay?
Yeah.
But you're aware of that, and they understand. But we also need to be cognizant of the fact that King is a mere guideline. It's not necessarily law. Okay, so you're always going to get pushback from certain execs to say it's not law. It's not necessarily for us to. Okay, it's best practice. Okay. So ask yourself. Usually all various organizations have their slogan, or what exactly are their principles? What are their values? What are their beliefs? Start from that. Look at their strategy. What do they want to achieve? Then I need to ask you, who exactly, if you've got a risk committee, who puts together the report? Is it the individual departments? How do they handle risk?
Currently, that's being handled by the CFD.
By the financial director.
And the CEO.
Okay, so risk management.
Well, assistance from divisional heads.
Okay, so talk about the lines of defense. Management is your first line of defense. Risk management is an assurance aspect of it. It's your second line of defense. If you equate it to the analogy of a soccer game, okay, you cannot have the same person being a player and a referee in a soccer match. You have to separate the two. So, there has to be an element of independence. And that's how you start the conversation. Because they need to understand these things. FD is worried about costs, yes. CEO is worried about, okay, what my targets are, what am I going to achieve, what is my strategy for the next year. I think you need to shift the mindset. And this it's a continuous conversation. It's not going to happen overnight. You're not going to have one conversation and they're going to say, oh, great, okay, let's employ someone. You can start off small, and say, okay, perhaps we should have one person dedicated. Part of this person's portfolio should be this. If you're mixing internal audit and risk, it's also, excuse the pun, but it's a risky game, because internal audit is risk-based. Once again, your player and your referee are the same person. They need to establish whether the controls are actually effective. You can't have the same person doing that.
No, in our case, it's not like that.
Okay.
I'm just making an example.
So I think you need to have the discussion of independence. You need to have the discussion of lines of defense, best practice, understand where the company is heading in terms of their strategy, what they want to do, and how risk management can help. If you can draw that picture, I think that's your first step forward, without knowing too much about the insides and out. But yeah.
So maybe just a comment on what Barbara was asking now. I think there's a lot of power in information. And what I've found, sometimes there's also a bit of disingenuity in that argument, like my champions must do it, it must be part of the organization, etc., etc. The moment you can put information on the table that shows that that's not working, and that information is already reported at some committee, EXCO, risk committee somewhere, you almost forced the hand. So together with putting that information on the table, offering a solution then becomes, oh, we thought of this. And then you start changing the culture. I think my question, if I can, before Terence, what is your comment or your view on the statement that you can't change culture? You can only identify the organization's culture and manage that to the extent that you can create a risk culture in that. And that's a statement that's quite often made. And I think, to some extent, I think that's true. So the whole question about whether it's a risk culture or organizational culture, you can't change it in any event. So how do you work with that?
I think culture is created by people. And it's also led by the CEO and the board in many aspects. I've been in an organization that was initially started off the culture was that of fear. And it moved progressively over a period of a year and a half, 18 months, to being more collegial and collaborative. And that can happen if you have buy-in from the top. And that's why it's so important for people to speak and have an understanding and have a relationship with various stakeholders. I think culture can change. I think an individual is capable of changing culture, but it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take time. And, there's a lot of external factors that influence culture as well. We're just talking about one aspect. You need to, and for me, I find culture and strategy also very closely linked. And if we can understand where the company is heading, we can understand, or we can try and change those behaviors to get to where they want to be as well.
I just wanted to maybe join those who hold a common view around what we see sometimes in the market. We see organizations who may tick all boxes collapse. We see organizations who have done everything right in our eyes collapse. So sometimes I begin to ask the question, are we perhaps struggling to deal with structure and complexity as we implement all of these disciplines? And we need to ask ourselves those questions very seriously, because recently I met a CRO who said that their audit outcome was very good the previous year. She had done very well. I reminded her that the company had gotten a disclaimer, therefore there's no way she did well. Do you understand? So we seem to sit in these walls of ours and we begin to think that if I follow this and if I can tick this and say it went well, then everything went well. But tomorrow in the board meeting, we're announcing a shutdown of a whole operation of the entity. So I think that there is something, this is an area we really need to give attention. We need to give it attention because the evidence is pointing us in the direction that says no matter what we are doing or what we say we are doing, something is amiss at some point. Somehow leadership is not empowered to manage effectively. They are not empowered to manage ethically and effectively. I always say that, sometimes when you're in boards, my first board that I got into, I asked somebody, what should I do? They said, listen. They told me to listen. Because the difficulty with those fiduciary duties at a board level is that you are in an organization you know less about than the CEO, and yet you must implement oversight over that very organization. So I didn't want to ask it as a question, but just to share in what you're trying to teach us today and say, this area needs a lot of effort, it needs a lot of research, a lot of work, because the evidence around us is worrying.
Yep.
Thank you.